My paper, to start off with, is I've called it Logics of Government Innovation and Reform in China. This is based on, there's a full paper that goes with this. The work for this was supported partly by STEPS and the Future Health Systems, so thank you very much to both. The question here really is why Chinese government, why is this important? And Chinese government has been, I think, very effective in managing a lot of change. There's very high speed, very fast change, complex change, and Chinese government has been incredibly important in this management process, in this change process. I think people are starting to understand now that Chinese government has got a particular way of managing reform, or particular ways of managing reform. There might be something here too that deserves understanding, trying to understand how this has happened and how this is done. There's a question here, China as an innovative polity. Are there other lessons that other countries can take from this? And in relation to work that STEPS is doing, sort of, can government be a powerful force in institutional innovation? The purposes of this paper really are to say that, to ask whether this government innovation is a useful concept in understanding Chinese government's management of change. So to question this concept, to provide a background or a framing for discussion that we're going to have of these other cases, but then also to prompt dialogue between Chinese research on this and research outside China. So what am I talking about with innovation? I should say very clearly, I don't think innovation is about agenda setting. It's not who is first to do something. Innovation is about creating and putting into use and spreading useful ideas. I think it's as simple as that, in a way. Newness is a difficult question. There's a lot of stumbling blocks around discussing innovation where newness becomes a problem. Who was first to do something? I think it's not a very useful approach. Why are we interested in innovation? It's important for developing and circulating ideas to manage and cope with a changing world. Now, why is China important in this? Because China's changing so fast. And so it's such a vast place. So how does Chinese government approach this? What are the approaches? Do they work? Do they not? Additionally, it's hard to know before the fact what is going to work. And even if you think it's hard to know what will work in what circumstances. And even if you did sort of think you knew that, it'd be hard to know how to create those institutions. These are questions around why innovation is a relevant process to be looking at, I think. So this is a developmental process. It's a developmental question. And the thing that is important to me, really, is processes and institutions over specific innovations. Any one specific institutional innovation is of relatively limited usefulness. The question is how you foster and manage and spread ideas, I think. So key terms here. I'm talking about government innovation, or in Chinese it's 政府创新, or local government innovation, which is all bound up together, which is 地方政府创新. Now these are two words that are very often used in Chinese academic discourse. I want to be clear that what I'm talking about here is not something that's just a few pilots somewhere that somebody's doing. I'm saying that there's a lot of analysis, there's a lot to be seen out there of local governments doing things in their own ways, trying to find solutions to problems. These are creating institutional innovations, and these are being circulated. There's a whole range of phenomena under this umbrella. It's not just a kind of a formal piloting process that the central government is involved in, which has received quite a degree of academic attention. Mostly what we're talking about is local governments, which is where really people have to implement policy. We're talking about a lot of city governments, county governments, places where actually that's where finally the policy that's set out by central government has to be institutionalized. Somebody has to do something. And that's where there's a lot of finding of solutions to these problems. A lot of it is county and city level. Counties are sort of, within all the analyses of this stuff, counties and cities come out as the main places that get signal for this. My analysis, this is based on, it's based on field work I did when I was doing my PhD. I was going around looking at how counties were implementing rural health insurance policy and the ways they were finding solutions to different problems within that. It's also based on a lot of literature in Chinese on local government innovation. So a lot of it sourced through Chinese academic databases and so forth, and to some extent a lot of policy documents, but they don't mostly come up in here. I've kind of presented this as around a set of stylized facts, which I think what I want to do here is just to set out what I'm saying, really. And one is that I think Chinese government means that much local government, the way this functions means that much local government policy innovation is actually embedded within the system of Chinese government functioning. It's not to say that people at local government level are doing this in a strictly voluntaristic way. They're not necessarily setting out to innovate, but there's a lot of churn, there's a lot of production of institutional practices which is there as part of the way the system functions. Second is that the multiple variant policy practices circulate a lot of the time, lots of different ways of doing things which are being done in different ways in different places and are moving around and being discussed or being borrowed and retransmitted. A range of different practices are tolerated for their contribution to the way the system gains, which is overall enlarging the range of institutional tools available in carrying out these reforms. So, I mean, within these, overall, I've kind of broken these down into a set of more detailed statements which says that the space for local government innovation within central government control of policy agendas and personnel management. And China does have an overall strong top-down structure, but there remains the space for this work to happen. Central government sets the policy agenda, local governments implement and develop a range of policy solutions and policy practices. Range of policy practices are tolerated for contribution to system level gains. This policy implementation and innovation are not really entirely separable. So within this idea of multiple variant policy practices in circulation at any one time, the range of informational infrastructures and transfer agents which help propagate variant practices. So these things circulate, they spread, there's discussion around these. Reforms show complex spatialities, the way that things work in different places. There are geographies of these changes. These ideas are moving around. Much government innovation is of little systemic usefulness. A lot of things are local solutions to local problems. They don't necessarily need to be useful elsewhere. They don't necessarily get transmitted elsewhere. They don't necessarily get studied from, but they remain local. Much local government innovation is not original, but again, I think this is a difficult problem, talking about newness and originality. Much is not actually very necessarily efficient, but it still may be valuable in terms of ways of coping with problems and managing change over time. And the important question for me really is systemic adaptation over short-term efficiency. It's how you manage change, not whether you can have a best fit, perfect institutional structure at this point in time. Now, I've got a few kind of slides here which really are an attempt to set out a set of words which are used very frequently in this policy discourse. And to use these as a way to kind of peg what I think is a certain set of understandings that are used frequently in government language on this, also frequently in the language of researchers in this. If we talk about this as, let's say, a policy community, these are a set of terms which are used an awful lot, often quite taken for granted. They're part of just a general framing of what this is about, I think. Now, when I'm saying this, I'm not saying this is just a central government use of language. I mean, when I was doing my field work, going around counties around China, I was finding very much the same kind of framings, the same kind of use of language to talk about what's going on, the same kind of rationalizations of these processes. So I think that's why these slides are set out in this way, to try and understand a set of terms that are used to describe these processes. The first is, this one has a bunch of terms related to space, policy spirit, and initiative. And this is a couple of quotes. And this is from Yu Keping, who runs, or used to run, the Local Government Innovation Program at the Central Compilation and Translation Bureau. He says, China is a unitary polity, Subnational government must obey central government and must carry out reform under the unified arrangement and direction of the centre. This is one side of the question. The other is that central institutions and policy give local government a lot of space for exercising initiative. So space, 空间, initiative, often 积极性 in Chinese. These ideas around what people are doing, like the space they have, and also the idea that they have initiative, they have a degree of self-determination or autonomy. Each place can, in line with their local conditions, experiment boldly according to the spirit of central policy. And spirit here, again, comes up as this kind of 精神, or it's 方向. It's kind of the direction of policy. And people are phrasing things in these ways. And you talk to them, you talk to local government policy people, implementers, and they're talking in these ways. They're using these words, right? So, I mean, these are words that, to me, in reading this, they come out because they hit me, because these are words that I've heard people using when they're talking about how they're doing their reforms. And what I want to do with what this is saying really is that this is a new framing of actually a very old desire within Chinese policy thinking. And this is a quote from Mao Zedong from 1956, which is quite a long time ago. He says, legislative powers are all vested in the central authorities, but provided that the policies of the central authorities are not violated, local authorities may work out rules, regulations and measures in the light of their specific conditions and the needs of their work. We want both unity and particularity. It's imperative to have strong and unified central leadership and unified planning, etc., etc., etc. It is essential to bring the initiative of local authorities into full play and let each locality enjoy the particularity suited to its local conditions. What I'm saying here really is that this is a new phrasing of actually something that has been in the policy discourse and dialogue for a long time. And here I'm saying a bunch of key words: space, local initiative, and central control or guidance. So my second page of slide of keywords, in DG, and I'm saying according to local conditions versus one size fits all. Now, different places have different socioeconomic, political and cultural conditions. And Professor Zhang just now was talking about the way that policy is implemented in different places, even things like anti-poverty, poverty alleviation campaigns and so forth. And there is this strong discourse about the understanding that every place in China is actually fundamentally somehow different from every other place, or that there's a specificity in local conditions and that has to be taken into account. So different places have different socio-economic, political and cultural conditions, and the difference between places is very large. Also large differences over time, etc., etc., etc. It's not possible to simply apply policy in a one-size-fits-all manner. So here I'm contrasting implementing according to local conditions, which is INDG, versus one-size-fits-all, 一刀切 policy. And there's a lot of rhetorical backing for subnational policy adaptation, experimentation and innovation. And this is from Wu at the time when she was vice premier, and this was in relation to development of the rural health insurance system. She was saying the difference in conditions between different rural areas is very large. It's impossible to adopt a one-size-fits-all policy. The main thing is for each area to experiment in the process of implementation in line with local conditions. I mean, these are all. This is something approaching a consolidated vocabulary that's talking about the same kind of thing and what people should be doing. And this is really to say that I've called it operationalizationable institutions, which sounds really difficult, but when I was doing my field work, I'd be going and talking to people about why they were doing what they were doing, and they'd all be talking about yali. They'd all be talking about the pressure to implement policy that they're under, because they've got targets, they've got policy coming down that they have to do something about, etc. There was always yali. There was always this pressure. But there's something I think very interesting about Chinese policy, the way that Chinese policy functions, which that there is this continual pressure that everybody talks about, but there's also an openness in policy which actually finally bottoms out at the point where you get to often to the county level or to the city level where people actually have to do something. And that leads to different processes, different institutions. And this is from, this is an academic article. He says, we use a method in which the centre sets the principles of policy and localities organise implementable, sorry, this is Wu again from the Rural Health Insurance, organise implementable policy. We encourage each locality to experiment and innovate, etc. And the next one, this is an academic one, he says, institutional innovation requires that every level of government create concrete operationalizationable 可操作的 institutions for the promotion of economic and social development under national institutional frameworks. And then you get this vocabulary of mechanisms. So 机制, methods, 措施, means, 方法, techniques, etc., 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 the way that people are talking about their local reforms and what they're doing. And there's this recognition that, yes, there's some policy, there's some general national framework for this, but what they're doing is creating some local process, some local mechanism, some local institution. So what my rationalization of this is here is direction and central reforms that's broadly understood but not operationally specified. So there are multiple possible ways of doing things, and then this develops this pool of ideas. Some of them spread, some of them don't, some of them are talked about, some of them are not. A lot of them remain very, very local, but some of them spread, some of them become part of an overall kind of conversation of reform. Most of them are fundamentally within overall policy paradigms. There was a survey of local government innovators, and they all said they were 落实性创新, as in their implementation type paradigms. They're trying to implement policy and they're finding ways of doing this. Most are not fantastic solutions to problems, but they're good enough solutions which are part of an ongoing policy development process or reform process. So what I'm saying here, really, there's a lot of second best processes. This is a process of institutionally embedded policy or practice, policy development of policy practices. Most are not best practice, most are second best or interim solutions to problems, but they're part of an overall approach to managing a reform process. And I'm also saying that this is embedded in the sense that this is something that is not aberrant or bizarre government behaviour. It's part of the way the system functions. And very briefly, there's an awful lot of learning going on. This is from an academic who works on this, and he says the various forms of learning, the systemic learning, 体制性学习, so where something is taken up and becomes part of an overall policy, autonomous learning, unintentional learning, secondary cumulative learning, etc. There's a lot of circulation of these practices. And just very quickly to flag before I finish, the informational infrastructures. This is bringing in to some extent a language from policy transfer studies elsewhere. There are ways to spread this information. There are media report a lot of this. There's a lot of cross-national learning where people go and look at other places. That's incredibly common. Transfer agents who play the role of propagating things and so on and so on and so on. Researchers involved to an extent, in some cases, not all, but there are various ways in which researchers or the research community can be involved, and also foreign actors. And I will stop there as a one final comment actually before I finish. What I'm trying to describe here is a systemic phenomenon, but I'm also saying this is not something that is representative. It's not that all innovations, China is permanently innovating good solutions to all problems. What I'm saying is this is a way to try and understand a certain mode of functioning of Chinese government, which appears to be important in the way that Chinese government manages reform. Not all solutions to problems are good. They are, however, part of an overall process of managing reform which keeps things going and is over time more important, in my view, than achieving a perfectly efficient management of policy system at any one point in time. And that's the overall point here, is about policy, management, adaptation, and how Chinese government functions to make that work.